Dave's based in Boston, joined us here this week, and you need very little introduction, Dave, do you?
Well, I've met a lot of people. I don't quite know everyone, but we'll do whatever you like. You want me to say a couple things about my background or what I do with Sedo, or?
Well, I'm supposed to ask you that, and
Okay.
then you say it.
I'll wait for whatever you say.
Hey, Dave, tell me about your background.
Sure. So I've been involved with domaining since the late 90s, and it's really my fourth career. I almost retired around that time. I had been working for a good 20, 25 years before the internet, and started out in banking. I was in marketing for 15 years with the two largest banks in America. I was senior vice president of marketing, mostly consumer-based marketing, a lot of direct response. I don't know if that's the term that's still used or not, but a lot of mailings that went out, millions, hundreds, tens of millions of mailings went out, some of them with my signature actually, to get people to sign up for different banking products. Actually, I just remembered a few minutes ago that I was involved in the largest mailing ever done in the UK in 1992. I was consulting for, I jumped ahead, but so after banking for 15 years, I started a consulting company. And one of my clients at the time was General Motors here. They owned Vauxhall, or they did own Vauxhall. And we did a very large mailing, I forget the number, but that time was the largest in the UK, to sign up people for the Vauxhall credit card. And it was different in the US. You pay a certain fee per envelope, and that's it. There's no negotiation. But in the UK, I don't know if it's still true today, you negotiate with the Postal Service the price. And I had lunch with the number 2 person in the, I think it was a postmaster or assistant, whatever, in the UK, and we negotiated a price for this. I think it was 9 million pieces of mail, so that was pretty interesting. But during the period of time that I had a consulting company, I did most of my work before domains and before the internet. Did a lot of work with banks and companies going to the internet, publishers, and miscellaneous other 3 or 4 other categories. But I get into domaining around that time because in the late 90s, one of my consultants was working on a project for, it was either Merrill Lynch or Fidelity. And email was just beginning. And we worked in different towns and cities. So my consultants would prepare a deck or PowerPoint or whatever, send it to me by floppy overnight by FedEx or UPS. And I'd review it before I went to the client. So I was reviewing this deck, and it had a great slide for bonds, and a great slide for stocks, and a great slide for equity. But there was a slide called inheritance, and it needed to be embellished. I didn't come from a lot of money. I didn't know a lot about inheritance, so I went to the internet to look up information on inheritance, and I just started using the internet around that time. There was nothing there. That day, I bought my first domain. It was inheritance.com, and I bought it in the aftermarket. It was either $4,000 or $5,000. The guy that I bought it from was so thankful. He was so happy. He had purchased it. He lived in a small town in the U.S., and he had purchased it with the intent to use it for something to do with music. I always thought of inheritance as, money being passed down. And that's how I got into it. And I ended up buying 5,000 names that year. My wife was going to kill me because we had 2 little kids, and it was, at that time, the only .com register I saw, leasing or selling.com was Network Solutions. You had to pay for 2 years, and it was $70, 70 USD, 35 per year. So 70 times 5,000 was $350,000, which was a lot of money for me, believe me, and it was a long time ago.
That explains why you didn't retire.
That's true. That's true. She had my best friend, her best friend, my sister, her brother, separately sit down with me and make sure I wasn't losing it. You know, they were ready to put a straitjacket on me. But this is, before domains, and or when domains were getting started. Most people had no idea about domains, so they thought I was nuts. But I was running this consulting company and doing some brokering in the 2000s. And
Brokering your own names?
My own, but also, good question, thank you. My own, but also for friends that were into it, that I had mentioned it to, just brokering part-time. And then I decided to broker full-time, which I did. We had some of you would remember, some were very, very young, I guess. We had a very bad recession, 2008, deep recession, almost a depression. And I shut down my consulting company, repositioned myself and my services towards digital. I'd always been bricks and mortar, and brokered full-time. After doing that for a few years, I decided to work for a company, and Sedo was the company that I ended up going to work for. And I've been working for Sedo now as broker for 13 years next month, which is a lot longer than I expected, but it's working out fine.
I think it's working out more than fine. Now, first, isn't there a British saying, thick as pea soup? Is that a saying about your weather or something? Fog? No. Oh, well, we see that in our American movies. Oh, James is British, he says yes. Okay, this conversation, Dave is so understated, and but I feel like thick as pea soup, everything you just said, there's so much to pull out of that, Dave. So you really have this trifecta of a background in marketing, in banking, and in entrepreneurship. I mean, those are the three things that we need for brokers to be able to speak to or evangelize. And then, so this is my summary of the story you just told. 3 spectacular, important backgrounds. Then you have the curiosity to his first day on the internet in the 90s, more or less first day on the internet. You didn't just buy a brand new domain, you bought an aftermarket domain. I mean, that must have been complicated to figure out, a little bit of risk, but not only did you do that, but you knew you had the conviction that it would work. And I thought when you said your wife sat you down, or sent others, I thought it was gonna be an intervention, did you? But it wasn't. It was a make sure he's okay, but support. What an incredible foundation for, the man I know today. I think I've known you, I started in the industry 18 years ago. I don't know, we met maybe around 08. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think that's right.
I don't think I ever knew you before Sedo.
Probably not, but I did come to conferences before that. But yeah, I think we met around that time, 2008, 2010.
Okay.
Yeah.
So around that time, definitely understand the recession. You decided to work for a brokerage firm, and you've stayed there this entire time. Clearly, you're already a pretty good decision maker. And then you chose this brokerage firm and you stayed there, which says something. Tell us about why you chose Sedo and what's made you stay there over the years. Just super quick. We're not trying to make an ad for Sedo, just trying to understand you.
Yeah. Trying to understand me, that's a complicated thing. But I didn't know much about, I knew about a couple of the different companies, but didn't honestly know a lot about Sedo, or I say Sedo, or a couple of our competitors. Sedo is 9 miles from my house, and
This is their Boston office.
Oh yeah, Boston office, right. Yeah, we have our headquarters in Boston for the US. Germany is our predominant headquarters. But I knew a couple of people that it turned out that actually worked for Sedo that I didn't realize, such as the CEO. I didn't realize he was even the CEO of Sedo. I met him at a conference. We had a couple of drinks together, and we had some conversations, and I figured it's right here. They have a good reputation, right by my house, and I would go to work for them. So, but I thought it would be for like 2 years. I was pretty sure, 2 years.
Well, of all the things in this story to be wrong about, that was the right one to be wrong about. Well done.
Thanks.
Yeah. So you have had an incredible career. Do you want to jump in? What I really want to know, the meat and potatoes, is tell me like the best day of your career. Not just, you know, the biggest, best thing you've ever done, but what you feel like was the best day that you felt such, you know, accomplishment, relief, something. You pick.
Yeah, thanks for that question. You know, I look back, it's been like 40-something years now, I think. I've had a great career, great careers. I've had a lot of fun, I've worked very hard. Probably what sticks out the most, though, and it's related to domains, actually, is, so I was into direct response and quantitative marketing, very rudimentary compared to what we do today, what we all do today, and what we know today. There wasn't a lot of storage space, there wasn't a lot of analytics, there wasn't a lot of data. I joined Citibank the month that they started the credit card division, so it was really basic stuff. But I was really excited about the internet that was coming in the 80s. As a matter of fact, it was called the Super Information Highway. I think it's fair to say that in the Boston Globe, which is the major newspaper, New York Times probably too, every single day for, I think it was 25 or 30 days, every single day, the headline was something like the Super Information Highway is coming. And think about it. It was before it came. What is it? Most people had really little idea. But I was very interested in it coming because I figured it was going to change everything, even the way that I did marketing. So I studied it, and much to my surprise, my wife was with me for this, actually. I was invited to meet with Jerry Ford, who was the 38th president of the United States. He had already retired. He was 69. It was 1988, I think. And a friend of mine who currently runs J.P. Morgan Chase, he's probably the most powerful banker in the country, in the world maybe. He and one of his colleagues introduced me to Ford. And Ford was asking me questions for 25 minutes about the Super Information Highway. It was like my wife couldn't believe it because she knew me and she just thought that he was wasting his time. But he asked me...
Don't skip it. He was really intensely, if you didn't catch this, the former president of the United States was pretty much interviewing you or asking you to teach him for 25 minutes straight, kind of ignoring everyone else, the few other people that were even in the room.
Yeah, that is true. There were I think 5 people besides him and my wife and myself, all 5 of them. One's currently the #1 guy at J.P. Morgan Chase. The other one's Sandy Weil, who founded Shearson Lehman. He was chairman of Citicorp. Who else was there? William Stadd, he was in charge of the AIG for 11 months before they folded. And Ford, his first question to me was, how can the Republican National Committee benefit from the Super Information Highway when it gets there? And I was lucky. I answered the question. I didn't know what he was going to ask me. I said, "You mean for fundraising or to get votes?" And he said both, and that's just what I wanted to hear. So we had a good conversation. However, I will also point out that was 1988. I didn't buy my first domain well into the 90s. You know, we just didn't think of buying domains. You know, the conversation was not about domain names, although we did talk about sites and people going to sites, but we didn't talk about domain names. So I left that conversation and didn't buy a domain name until I bought inheritance.com in the late 90s. So I probably made a big mistake there. Because I have some clients that got their names for free or paid $10 in the late 80s, early 90s. And, you know, a couple of them have many millions of dollars of cash from selling those names. But I didn't buy my first one for several years after that. And a lot of people that have great names that are selling them today because they're retiring bought their first name back then and no other names for 15, 20 years. It just wasn't, you didn't have conferences about domains. You didn't have people buying and selling domains. It was something that you just didn't consider.
It's always a fascinating conversation when someone tells you they have like a 2-character or a really old 3-character.com, and that's all they have. And you say, how'd you get it? What's your story? It's always a good story.
Right.
So I'm hearing, I mean, you built your network in those years. Not, you know, that wasn't your intention. You were trying to retire, or have a career and retire, but you built a network. Then you practiced yourself with the domain names and really understood the domain investor's purpose. And then you moved into brokering. So is Gerald Ford the best day of your career?
I'd say yes.
You want to share anything more about it?
About that day?
Yeah.
When I shook hands with him, it's probably not relevant. When I shook hands with him, he almost broke my knuckles. And I said that to him. He used to play football for Princeton or Yale, and he was very strong physically. He was already, I think, 68 or 69, but he really had a great handshake. I've told that story a few times. I don't really talk about that much, but I did mention it to Elliot Silver, who writes domaininvesting.com over in the U.S.
Only Bostonians get shout-outs here. I'm from Boston. He lives there. Elliot lives there. Keep going.
Elliot does live in Boston, although he went to school in New York. We have a big rivalry. It's not a football rivalry, it's baseball. It's the Boston Red Sox and New York Yankees. I don't know how he did it, but he went to school there for 4 years wearing a Red Sox hat and never got beat up. But anyway, I was having dinner with him one night, and I told him this story about Ford. And then the next day, he wrote it up in his blog. This was like 15 years ago. But I think it's the first time I've talked about it in this kind of format, this forum like this. But it was really interesting at that time for people like myself who were into marketing. Could have been finance, could have been medical careers, whatever. I was into marketing, and I thought that the internet would be a great way to track and get results immediately. Whereas, you know, in the 80s, you can get results. You had to manually tabulate or maybe ask your company to do a run over, and they do it overnight when CPUs weren't used that much. With the internet, you could test instantly. I mean, I had been involved in, not in the TV commercials, but making TV commercials and magazine ads. I didn't make them. We had creative people that made them. And you want to measure them for your client. At that time, I was the client, I guess, but you wanted to measure them so you know where to spend your next dollar, your next pound. You know, especially if you're talking hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars investing, you want to measure and change things. The internet changed all that. It made it happen quicker, more accurate. And then having been involved with branding over the years, you know, the domain space was a very attractive place for me, which I've enjoyed tremendously. And I've been able to work on some of the best domains and sell some of the best domains. And used some tricks that we used to use back then in terms of how do you get to the right people. Well, if you're selling to a corporation, as an example, before the internet, you needed to get to people by phone or mail. There wasn't even email. Email was something used between some of the big universities that were using what's now called the internet. I forget what they called it, something else, some gateway. There were 6 big universities. I think Oxford may have been one of them. There was one in Boston, I think it was MIT. There were 6 of them that were sharing information over what's now called the internet, but it wasn't being used for commercial use. But the principles of marketing, starting with positioning and objectives and tactics and strategy and measurement, they all still apply. But now it's all digital. It's much more sophisticated. Cut out a lot of the time, some of the middle. You know, we used to say middle men. Now maybe it's middle people is the appropriate, you know, politically correct way of saying things. I'm just having a blast. and I really am. It's just, it's very, and I know that I have a different perspective than a lot of the brokers because I'm older than, maybe I'm the oldest broker, but most of them, I think, have not worked without the internet. So it just, I feel like I have an advantage from the way things used to work to how you can apply those principles to the net. And it's helped me broker some great names at some great prices.
I agree with all of that. I think you left out the absolute depth of your network. You know, you're great at picking up the proverbial phone book or, you know, resources before the internet, after the internet, but the depth of your network, both when you began and now, are tremendous. Let's talk a little about today. You mostly broker 6 to 8 figure sales. Is that? I mean,
Yes.
I think I'm right that you're in top 10 brokers in the world. You're absolutely on that list. Do you work on anything under 6 figures?
I do. Usually I'm working on 100,000 plus. Sometimes we have Sedo has a client, could have even been somebody that I did something for, who wants to sell something for 30,000.
Oh, we all do, yeah, like a
and I'll
favor,
do that.
sure.
I'll do that. But
Okay.
no, but I mean, we have a lot of brokers, and they work at all different extensions, different values. I tend to work on the highest values, so it's usually over 100.
Okay, but highest
mainly
values,
6.
we all really want to know. Let's talk about 8-figure sales. Any that you can talk about?
I'm working on 2 of them right now. I can't talk about those.
Would you say that's typical? You're often working on a couple?
It has been for the last 3 or 4 years. Yeah, I had worked on one. This one I can mention, actually. I wasn't directly involved. This goes back about 30 years, I think 30 years. When I was consulting, I was involved indirectly in yellowpages.com. That sold for $100 million. It came with a business.
Do you want to give the year
The year?
that it sold?
I'm not sure. I'm going to say 25, 30 years ago. It was before I was directly involved with domains. But I was consulting for one of my clients was involved in the deal. They said that there were 4 of them valued the business that came with yellowpages.com. The top valuation was $15 million, which meant that, in theory, the domain was $85 million. But other than that, ones that I've been directly involved in, I have been involved in a few 8-figure sales. The top one, I can't mention these NDAs. The top one was close to $30 million. The 2 that I'm working on now, I don't know if they're going to happen or not. I've been working on them for several months. One's going to be in the 20s, and the other one will be over 10 million, but I'm not sure where. And I don't know if they're going to happen or not. But I do work on quite a few 7-figure deals. And I say most of them are in 6 figures.
Okay.
Most of them 6 figures.
And what's the general time frame for most of your deals?
Well, it depends upon, first of all, is it a seller that I'm working for, or is it a buyer? If we assume seller, because it's usually seller side, it's all over the place. I recommend that I work on a 6-month contract with the idea that we'll get it done before the 6 months. Sometimes it gets extended. Sometimes we get an offer for more than the required minimum on day 1. And I say to my client, don't sell. Because if we can get an offer like that day 1 without really reaching out to enough people, we're going to get more. And most of the time they won't sell. I say on average they sell in about 3.5 to 4 months. Some never sell. Some sell, but the price comes down later on. No 2 deals are alike. They really aren't. The sellers are different, the buyers are different, the cultures are different, the legal issues, if there are any, are different. So sometimes they want to review a contract and make a lot of changes that can slow it down. But I'd say on average 3.5 to 4 months. If I'm working for a buyer, I think this is true generally for brokers. Working for a buyer, it's a lot less. Because not everybody agrees with this, but to me, buyer side brokerage is easier because you have the buyer.
I think everybody agrees with that.
I would think so, but I've actually had brokers, even some at Sedo, disagree with me on that. Yeah, I'm serious. So the negotiation might be the same, except you're negotiating to get the price down rather than up. The contract, the purchase and sale agreement, that's the same. Both sides have to review it. The big difference is you have the buyer, and you usually know who the seller is. Now, if you don't know who the seller is because they're in privacy, which is more and more common today, or they're hiding, then you have that complication. But normally, when it comes to a premium domain, especially these days, because we've been around doing it for a while, we know who owns the domain. And if it's not somebody we know, there are some tools, or some colleague may know. So then you don't spend all the time required to find a buyer when you're selling a name. Because finding a buyer can take time. That's if it's a 6-figure deal. 7-figure deal, usually it takes a little bit longer. All of it takes longer. There's more lawyers involved. There's typically larger corporations, and they have their processes. But certainly under 6 months, but not 3.5 to 4. The 8-figure ones, which really aren't that common, and we don't hear about most of them, they'll take even longer. However, there have been a few that went very quickly because you have a name, and it's obvious there's only a very small group of companies or individuals that can afford that kind of a name. So it's easier to get to them. And if they can move quickly, it doesn't take that long. But usually it takes long because they can't move quickly. They have to get the highest levels of approval, or they have to raise the money, or they want to pay over time, and that can take time to structure the deal. So it's a little bit longer. The 4- and 5-figure deals, that we do in the marketplace, or some of the junior brokers do, they go very quick usually, days. And a lot of it depends, of course, on the motivation of the seller, the motivation of the buyer. If a seller that is hungry, needs or wants the cash because they're investing in technology, or it's an individual, they need the money because, unlike, I think in Europe, where college isn't that expensive usually, I think in Germany it's even free. In the US, it's very expensive. So if you have a couple of kids going to college, you want to sell a premium name, if you waited too long, tuition is due in a week, or you want to buy a house, and the buyer, if the buyer is really dead set on that name, and only that name, which is very often the case, and they're deep-pocketed, they're going to be highly motivated. And they may play games, even with me as their broker, which I don't recommend. They might say they don't have the money and try to take their time. And that kind of strategy works sometimes, but it can also backfire. So it's really all over the place.
Well, what I really hear over and over from what you're saying is that you listen. Your whole sales approach, both with your client, whom you're representing, and also with, in most cases, the prospective buyers. It sounds like would you describe your sales approach? And if you had one piece of advice for the brokers in the audience, on negotiation, what would it be?
Well, I like that question. A very good question. You really want to know your customer, and you really want to know your prospects. There was a bank in the U.S. that's now part of Bank of America, the other big company that I worked for when I was much younger. And they acquired Merrill Lynch, they acquired MBNA. MBNA was a very large credit card issuer in the U.S. And above the door of every, above that exit light, there's something up there. Above the door of every office, it said, know your customer, because they were a client, know your customer. And I think they were right, because they provided great service. I do try to understand my customer, understand, understand the motives, so I can help them. And is the prospect an individual? Is it, what culture? How do they negotiate? Is it a company? Is it a cash-rich company? Is it a startup? What's their history with marketing, branding? How do they roll products out and all that? It definitely helps me figure out my strategy. And I don't ask a lot of questions, though, when I'm working with someone. Because questions, even before the internet, when there were surveys done, now we have all these instant surveys. Back then, you had to make phone calls or, fill out letters and have them send it in, give them £1 or $1 in the envelope, whatever. And it took time. And back then, way back then, a couple of questions that turned people off were, one was household income, and two was age, especially for women. And maybe that's different today, but especially for women. And so if you were doing a survey, an important survey, to figure out how much to spend on TV, 10 million, how much are magazines, whatever, 3 million, whatever it may be. You put those questions at the end. Get all the answers, and then if they don't want to answer those two, that's fine. Because they weren't pressing a button to confirm it, they just put it in the envelope. So, but I know that some people don't like to answer questions, so I don't ask a lot of questions, but I've been lucky for the most part because clients and also prospects will talk. Now, you don't know whether or not they're lying, if they're hiding behind a Gmail account, they really work for a company or what their budget is. But unless you have reason to think that they're lying, you pretty much go with what they're saying. And then, you're better able to craft your strategy. In terms of advice to brokers, I think one mistake that brokers make is they don't spend enough time figuring out what domains to work on or which domain to work on. It really needs to be a good domain. I'm not saying necessarily a $3 million domain or a very expensive domain, but it really needs to be a domain that's sellable. And it needs to be sellable within a reasonable amount of time. And you get that experience over time when you do this more often. But I see some great brokers, some well-known brokers. Some of them are great, some aren't great. But they're working on these names that really aren't that interesting or enticing. And they say that they're doing that because they don't have any other names to work on. Well, I think they might be better off not working on those particular names. And also trying to get realistic expectations from your client, the seller. Because, obviously, if the client wants 10 times what you think you can do, you're wasting your time. On the buyer, that was on the seller side. On the buyer side, I think, and always have a contract. On both sides, some brokers don't require contracts, which I think is a mistake. Sedo does. I can't do anything without a contract, and that's fine with me. But on the buyer's side, make sure that their expectations are real. If they're going after a oneword.com that is short, easy to spell, has very high e-commerce potential, and a lot of it, then sure, it's 7 figures, maybe more. But if your client, the buyer, only has a budget of a couple $100,000, and you look around what these names are going for, don't waste your time. I think too many brokers waste their time thinking that they're working. We used to have a saying, I don't know if it means anything here in the UK, or if it's even said that much more in the US. We used to say something like, it's very difficult to sell frozen ice cream to Eskimos or people like in the North Pole, right? Or something about a vacuum cleaner. It's difficult to sell
Ice to Eskimos.
ice.
See, James is agreeing with all of them.
Yeah. Well, domain, it's something, it's an asset. It's a digital asset. And while valuation is very subjective and not scientific like physical real estate, you need to, as a broker, or even as a seller or a buyer, you need to think about what's realistic. Of course, you want a lot more if you're selling. You want it for cheaper if you're not. But valuation is very important, and take the time to do it. I know that I have a little network of about, 15 or 18 brokers, not in Sedo. I also will ask in Sedo that I'm going to work on a name. If I feel I can, I'll ask them what it's worth, they think, and they'll do it with them confidentially. And you'd be surprised, even among skilled, experienced brokers, the range is phenomenal. You typically get, if you have asked 10 opinions, you might get 3 or 4 that are pretty tight. You'll have an outlier that's like 10 times the average, and one that's like 5 times less than the average. Just ridiculous. But maybe ridiculous is the wrong term, but it's unfortunate because valuations are all over the place. And it's not like physical real estate, like I said. So, if you have 10 row houses or townhouses on a street, and you have public information about the sales, I assume it works like that here. This is how it works across the pond. So you have 10 properties. They're all townhomes. They're all roughly the same size. They each have a 1-car garage, typically 2-bedroom. Some of them have updated kitchens. Some have updated whatever. Some have a little bit of land on the sides, the ends. But you have all the sales data. You have a good idea what those townhomes are worth within a range. They're good comps. There aren't really good comps. I'm sorry. The comps aren't as good with domains. There's only one way to say, cup.com. It's different than cup.net. It's different than cups.com, cups, the cup, cup.net, my cup. So then you say, okay, well, I'm just picking these up because I see them here, but they work. Here's a glass, a glass. So glass.com versus cup.com. Which one's more valuable? Well, you're working on cup.com. You happen to know that glass.com sold, and you happen to know the price, which is big assumptions because chances are it wasn't public. But it sold 29 years ago, 26 years ago. Had to use it as a comp. So there's a lot of problems with comps, and a lot of different ways to value the comp. A lot of different ways to come up with valuation. But it's important that when you're working on a name, take the time to see if you and your client are relatively on the same page with evaluation, and you understand that it's a good name to sell, or you have a really good chance to buy it for a client. If the client wants a great name and it's being used by some huge company and it has for 20 years, you're not going to get it. That said, there are exceptions.
Okay. Well, I think, can you hear me okay? I think so. He's so collaborative. So I'd like to summarize what you said, but save my memory, I'm going to do it backwards. So you said your advice to brokers on the outbound side, on the acquisition side, is to set reasonable expectations. Your advice to brokers on the inbound side is to choose your time, really know your domain, perhaps utilize your network, and only come to the table if, in the first place, if it's really worth your time, and that makes tremendous sense. And before that, I don't know if I can go back that far. See, he's like, you can. He's so supportive. No, before that, what you were saying, I don't think I can. It was such a good thought, I lost it. But I'll come back to it. What I really appreciate about you, Dave, is how even keel you are and how you pull in your consultative selling approach with each party, with the buyers, with the sellers. You pull in your network. And I think that's really been a key to your success. We need to wrap it up, but I have like 800 more questions for you. But I guess I'll share with the audience. And I think we're down to one mic in the place. So if you have a question, will you take it to them? No, but then Dave needs to answer. Actually, just holler or come up, either one. Go ahead, Adam.
Dave, you are a great broker and fantastic, experience. So great respect to you. My question is the following: there is a hypothesis that the best deals happen when a buyer wants to buy and he originates a transaction, not when a seller necessarily comes and wants to sell. What is your opinion on the case where you represent the seller and how you differentiate yourself and your fantastic domain in a moment when you offer the sale and a buyer is not necessarily requesting the specific moment their one specific acquisition, and you have to deal with him and you have to differentiate yourself and your great name and not to be considered as just a salesman.
Well, thanks, Adam, for the kind words, and I have the same level of respect for what you do and what you've done. But I want to make sure I followed you. So you're saying that the best and the easiest sale is when you have a very hungry buyer with a lot of money, goes to get the name that he wants or she wants. But you're asking if you're selling a name and the buyer is not that motivated, how do you convince the buyer to buy? Okay, great. That's usually what I do. I'm usually working with a name and having to go find buyers. And when you find buyers that are interested, usually they'll, unless they're billionaires, and sometimes we're lucky and they are, unless they're billionaires, they're going to have all the reasons why it's not worth that much. They're going to say things like, well, you have the singular cup, but somebody else has cups, therefore it's not as valuable. Or cup can mean a couple of different things, and it means something bad in certain countries, whatever. And there's a lot of different ways to say cup, whatever they come up with. Or there's not enough traffic. There's not enough business. So know your buyer now. Know who you're talking to. If you're talking to a company, it's a good idea, I think, to try to assume you know the company's business model. So let's say this company you're trying to sell to, they manufacture cups. And or they tell you, you ask them, how much money they make on a cup. And they say, we make $1 on a cup, every cup. So if you're trying to sell for $2 million, that after they sell 2 million more cups, they break even. They now own the domain, and they can keep it or sell it. But, and how long would it take to to make $1 on 2 million cups? Well, there's some assumptions there. What do they do today? They make, 100,000 cups a month. So it would take them 20 months to make an additional 2 million. But the idea is that the domain is going to bring in more business because right now their domain is not an optimal domain. Sometimes that works. If you're yeah, or maybe, it depends on the situation, maybe their competitor is growing and ready to go into the cup business, so it's a defensive strategy. And there's no better way to say cup.com if you want to sell, cups versus cup, they're both very good. So depending on which one you're working on, you're probably not selling both. You need to, push that domain relative to what else is out there. If it's an individual you're selling to, and sometimes you don't know. Somebody says, oh, I'm buying this for myself, but they're really a consultant for Amazon or whoever. You can make some assumptions, but you pretty much assume it's really an individual unless you know something. So for that individual, you try to help them understand why this will be valuable to them. They can get into the cup business. They can sell it, resell it. It's a good depending upon where they are. In China, as an example, when I think it's still true, but I looked at it pretty carefully a few years ago. When the stock in the U.S., when the stock market goes up, probably here too, people have more disposable income, and one of the things they do is spend more money on domains. Now, we're tracking domain spending more and more every day, but we don't track it like cars. The government doesn't track it like cars or bonds, whatever. But there is some tracking going on. So we know that when the market goes up, there's more money for housing, for domains, and other things. In China, it's the opposite. When the stock market goes down, it's usually because the government did something. Investors don't like it. They run and buy domains. So who are you dealing with? And that's true about China. I don't think it's true about most countries. But are you dealing with an individual, that needs to, in China, that wants to spend the money because it's safe? More likely it's in another country, but where it's more typical, they might have less money if the market went down. But are you dealing with a very wealthy individual? If you are, then the sales strategy is probably more about differentiation in the marketplace, the value of this domain, how you can position and sell, as opposed to the budget. If you're dealing with, usually people will just say, even companies will say, this is my max, my final offer. I'm not going to go a penny higher, after. And I just as a quick diversion, I oftentimes tell clients, if I'm working for you, I sign a contract with you. Sedo has, and I have, a fiduciary responsibility to do my best for you. So be honest with me, so I know how to negotiate for you. Don't bluff with me. Let me bluff with them. But let's bluff the buyer, but don't bluff me. So I might say to the buyer, look, is this really, really your final offer? Because the seller is saying, I want a final offer, period. Or take the reverse. The seller is making an offer to sell, and he's only going to come down this far. And the buyer's saying, if it doesn't come down to there, that's it. Well, sometimes a buyer or seller will walk, even though that's not exactly what the other side wanted. Sometimes they walk, and it's principle, it's ego, and they won't come back. But if you're working with somebody that's budget constrained, then the conversation needs to be about budget and why this thing's really worth it. If it's a Fortune 500 company, and when I had my consulting company, we worked with 23 Fortune 500 companies, some of them for several years. I even had a gig here, come to think of it. In the 90s, for 4 months, early 90s, I was in London every Tuesday. I used to come Monday night, I'd go back on Wednesday. I was working for Vauxhall and HSBC. And anyway, that was just a diversion. But the client really needs to be honest with the broker, because especially if they're talking about budget, and you want to be sure that if it's a final offer, it's not really a final offer plus another opportunity, or Another quick, I don't know if I've answered your question. Another very quick diversion is the culture makes a big difference in negotiation. And I'll just use China and Turkey, only because I have a bunch of experience with those two countries, where they're different cultures and different than the U.S. It used to be up until, maybe it's changing right now, but up until a year ago, and maybe it's the same, when I'm selling an offer from China, usually the offer was like 30 to 40% of the value, or the asking price. Turkey, almost always, and I think we probably have at least 1 or 2 people from each country in here, but almost always from Turkey, the offer was 75 to 80% what I was looking for. Final offer, no questions asked, take it or leave it. But they usually would go up another 5 to 7 or 8%, but that was it. So, you have to know who you're dealing with. Sorry if I was rambling. I don't know if I got to your question, but.
I think we learned all sorts of interesting things. One more question? Kieran, just stand up and holler.
I assume most of the domains you're dealing with are .coms. Do you have any thoughts about the value of other GTLDs, CCTLDs, and new GTLDs? When you see one, you go, no, and you go, oh, this is value of this. How do you perceive the other trading?
Yeah, well, it is true. Mostly I work on .com, but I have sold other names. I just use the UK since we're here. It's been a while, and I think it was a great sale. I may have been working for the buyer. I don't remember, but I think furniture.co.uk was like $650 or something like that, and purple.co.uk, I think it was like $150 or so. It was a long time ago. 650,000 for furniture.co.uk. I was probably working for the buyer. I don't remember for sure. But I have done some country sales. I've done some of the new TLDs.
What are your favorite?
I like the same ones you keep on hearing about. I like .ai, .io, .co. We sold a lot of these at Sedo. We're selling a lot of .its now. We sold a lot of .des, but companies from there. But
What do you say no to?
what do I say no to? I say no to most of the rest, and I'll tell you why. And I still say the exact same thing I said several years ago before 2000 more came out, like 6 years ago. What I believe will happen is something like 15 to 25 of them will stick, and most of them, I'm not talking about the CC, I'm talking about all the new GTL, not the country ones. 15 to 25 of them will stick. Many of them will fold. But at the end of the day, .com is still king. And the reason is because of what we used to call the halo effect, which I think has changed meanings in the business world. The halo effect is, in this case, there'll be so much confusion. People can't remember more than 30 websites in their head, 20, 30, 40. Maybe some of us can. But with all the different extensions, all the confusion for this one versus that one, this one, the .com just rises up because there's no confusion around it. So I tend to stick with the .com. I do say no to most of the other ones. However, that's me. Sedo, I think we're working on hundreds of extensions. And we list them. Brokers work on just about every extension. I think that there are ways to evaluate the extensions, which are important. Usually, I do it in my mind as a percentage of the .com. And also look at sales in the same extensions. Unfortunately, most sales are not published. Once you get over 100,000, only 5% are published. But we have some data internally we can look at, even if it's not published. We see what they're going for.
And Sedo, I know, has, I believe, 52 languages spoken by their brokers. So I think the CCTLDs do very well there. But I think it's time to wrap it up, and it's super perfect that I remember what I wanted to say before, and it's a great ending. Dave comes across as so even keel, but earlier I went through this complete emotional roller coaster, which is when you know you're working with a really fabulous salesperson. When I asked, I don't know what I asked, but your answer was that you don't ask questions. And I have to sit here and have a conversation and be quiet, which already is difficult. And then when he says something like that, I don't ask questions, I mean, whew, right? And then he says, well, I mean, you know how it feels when you get asked a survey. And my heart went in completely the opposite direction. I hate surveys. So first I'm shocked and horrified when he says it. Then I'm completely agree with him and remember how much I absolutely hate survey questions, don't we all? And then you just say, you listen. You let them tell you. You give them the space to give you that information. And you draw, and then you said, and then you kind of gauge it, which really is you pull from the wisdom of your experience. And thank you today for sharing just the tremendous depth of your wisdom. I really, really appreciate having you in this industry. If we had our glasses, I would do a cheat. Well, we do. We have glassandcup.com. To you, Dave, thank you so much for being here, not only in the UK, but in our industry. So.
Thank you. Cheers.